April 1st, 1922. A rented house on a hillside above Funchal, Madeira. The rooms are damp. The furniture belongs to the landlord. In the bedroom, a 34-year-old man is dying of pneumonia, his breathing audible from the corridor. His wife sits beside him. She is 29 and pregnant with their 8th child. A priest has administered the last rites, and now a boy is brought in, 9 years old, dark suit, standing at the foot of his father's bed. The boy's name is Otto. 3.5 years ago, his father was the Emperor of Austria and the King of Hungary, sovereign of 50 million people. Now the Emperor owns nothing in this room. The boy will inherit nothing from it except an expectation that the son must continue what the father could not finish. The world believed the Habsburg story ended when the empire fell in 1918. It did not. The real story, the private one, the one that cost the most, began in this room and continued for the rest of the century. A widow turned grief into a program. 8 children were raised for a throne that no longer existed, educated in borrowed houses across 4 countries, and taught that their exile was temporary. This is the story of those children. How a dynasty that ruled half of Europe survived as a household, then scattered into lives no one predicted. One brother who signed away the claim, one who refused, a sister who worked among refugees under a false name, and a posthumous daughter who never knew the father whose absence governed everything. 8 decades, 3 continents, and a question none of them could answer. What do you owe a world that no longer exists? To understand what was lost in that room on Madeira and what was created in its place, you have to go back. Not merely to the war that ended the empire, or the abdication that never quite happened, or the train that carried the family out of Austria on a gray morning in March 1919. You have to go back much further. You have to understand what it meant to be a Habsburg before any of it fell apart, because the weight of what came after makes no sense unless you first feel the weight of what came before. And the weight of what came before was not simply wealth or territory or political authority. It was a particular kind of belief, held so deeply and for so long that it had ceased to feel like belief at all and had taken on the character of natural law. The belief that a family could be a civilization, that a bloodline could be a form of government. The children born into the right house were not merely inheriting property or privilege. They were inheriting an obligation that stretched back centuries and was supposed to stretch forward for centuries more. And that anyone raised inside that obligation owed their life, their education, their marriages, their prayers, and their obedience to its continuation. The Habsburgs were not a titled family in the way that phrase is usually understood. They were not landowners who accumulated influence over a few generations, or industrialists who bought respectability, or minor royals who married strategically upward. They were, by the early 20th century, one of the oldest continuously ruling dynasties in European history, a house whose origins reached back to a castle in the Swiss canton of Aargau in the 11th century, and whose formal identification with Austria began in 1282, when Rudolf I invested his sons with the Austrian duchy. From that foothold, the family expanded, through war, through treaty, through the sheer accumulative logic of dynastic marriage, into a system that governed Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, and at various points substantial portion of the Low Countries, Italy, Spain, and the Americas. By the time the 20th century arrived, the Habsburg name did not refer to a single country. It referred to a supranational order, Catholic, hierarchical, multilingual, ceremonially dense, and old enough to seem less like a political arrangement than a geological formation. The empire the Habsburgs presided over contained Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Italians, and others, held together not by a shared language or a common national sentiment, but by a shared sovereign. The family was the institution. Remove the family, and the logic that bound a dozen peoples into one state would have no center. That is not exaggeration. That is how the system was experienced from inside. A child born into the Habsburg court would have been surrounded by a world in which the family and the state were, in practical terms, inseparable. The wealth alone tells that story, though it tells it in a way that resists neat figures. Unlike a British landed family, whose fortune could be reduced to acreage, rental income, and a trust deed, the Habsburgs' material world was a tangle of legal categories that had accumulated over centuries and that even contemporaries found fiendishly difficult to separate. There was crown property, the lands, forests, mines, and buildings attached to sovereign office, belonging not to the man who wore the crown, but to the crown itself. There was court property, the palaces, art collections, carriages, libraries, stables, and vast administrative apparatus maintained for the daily functioning of the imperial household. There was the state civil list, the annual sum voted by parliament to sustain the monarchy's operation and keep the machine turning. There was the Familienversorgungsfonds, the family support fund, established to provide for the maintenance of archdukes, archduchesses, and their households across multiple branches and generations. And there was personal property, which in theory belonged to the sovereign as a private individual, but which in practice could not be cleanly distinguished from any of the other categories, because the sovereign's private life and his public function had been woven together for so many generations that the legal seams had long since disappeared. The physical world this wealth sustained was immense. Schönbrunn Palace, with its 1,400 rooms, its park stretching to the Gloriette on the hill, its menagerie, its botanical gardens, its theater, a universe sufficient to raise a child without ever leaving its walls. The Hofburg in central Vienna, the working seat of imperial government, a complex of buildings so vast and so layered by centuries of construction that it was effectively a small city within the city, containing chanceries, chapels, treasuries, the Spanish riding school, and the private apartments of the sovereign's family. The royal palace in Budapest, seat of the Hungarian crown, overlooking the Danube from Castle Hill, the Belvedere, Augarten, Schloss Eckartsau, Villa Wartholz at Reichenau and Irax, agricultural estates across Lower Austria and beyond. These were not personal possessions in the way a country house in Wiltshire might be a family's own. They were the architecture of a political world, and the family lived inside them the way a government lives inside its own institutions. A child who grew up in those rooms would understand identity spatially before he understood it intellectually. He would know who he was by the corridors he walked through, the chapel where the family assembled each morning, the state apartments where ministers waited in anteroom after anteroom, the nursery windows that looked out over gardens, maintained by hundreds of staff. The morning routine was religious. The social intercourse was ceremonial. The languages spoken at table shifted depending on which part of the empire was being discussed. Identity was not something the child would need to search for. It was imposed by the building, by the calendar, by the liturgical year, by the succession of court events that marked time as surely as any clock. Remove those rooms, remove the daily mass, the changing of the guard, the ministers in the corridor, the governesses trained in court protocol. And you did not simply inconvenience the family. You removed the physical language through which they understood who they were. What that meant in emotional terms was that a Habsburg child did not grow up learning to distinguish between self and role. The family's social code was built around continuity, ritual, religious observance, and the foundational assumption that individual lives existed in service to dynastic office. There was a prescribed way to eat and a prescribed way to pray. There was a manner of greeting, a manner of mourning, a manner of sitting and standing and walking that signified one's position within the house. There were languages to be mastered: German, Hungarian, French, Czech, and often more, not because they would be useful in any ordinary career sense, but because the empire required its rulers to address its peoples in their own tongues, and the people spoke differently in Prague and in Zagreb, in Vienna and in Trieste. There was Catholicism, not as private devotion alone, but as the public skeleton of the entire system, woven into every coronation oath, every state funeral, every diplomatic relationship with the Vatican, every marriage contract. And above all, there was the expectation that each generation would produce the next, that each child would be formed for a role, and that the role would be waiting. The whole system depended on that assumption. It had never, in the memory of anyone alive, been proved wrong. The machinery had been running for so long that by 1900 it had acquired the feeling of permanence. And permanence, once assumed, becomes invisible. The people inside the system could not easily see what people outside it were beginning to suspect. That the multinational empire was under mounting strain from nationalist movements it could not absorb, from a parliamentary structure it could not fully modernize, from a military alliance system it could not control, and from a simple biological fact that no amount of ceremony could address. Franz Joseph had been on the throne since 1848. He was 86 years old in 1916 and had already outlived his only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, who died at Mayerling in 1889, and his wife, Empress Elizabeth, assassinated in Geneva in 1898. He was the empire in human form, and his longevity had created the powerful illusion that the system would outlast any crisis because it had already outlasted so many. His great nephew, a young archduke named Charles, had no particular reason to believe he would be the one asked to prove that illusion wrong. Charles was born on August 17th, 1887, at Persenberg Castle in Lower Austria, the eldest son of Archduke Otto of France and Princess Maria Josepha of Saxony. His position in the line of succession was remote enough that his childhood was shaped more by general Catholic formation and standard military education than by the specific pressures of the throne. He served in the army, he attended garrisons, he was trained for the kind of senior administrative and military responsibility that archdukes of the blood were expected to assume. He was not trained for sovereignty. By every account, Charles was conscientious, devout, personally gentle, and possessed of a sincere desire to do right by both God and his people. Qualities that, in a calmer era, might have made him an admired ruler, and in his own era made him desperately, fatally vulnerable. He prayed, he agonized over decisions. He believed in the duty of a Christian sovereign to protect his subjects from unnecessary suffering. He was not a weak man, but he was a man whose strength ran through channels that the crisis of 1914 to 1918 did not reward. He was kind where ruthlessness was needed, scrupulous where cynicism might have saved time, and faithful to principles that the political world around him had already begun to treat as irrelevant. For his children, the consequence was paradoxical. They would grow up knowing their father as a saint, quite literally, in the Catholic beatification process that would eventually be opened for him, rather than as a living, complicated parent. His goodness became his monument, and monuments are difficult to grow up beside. What changed his trajectory was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand at Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. Franz Ferdinand had been the heir presumptive, the man the entire succession was organized around, the figure the court, the government, and the foreign ministries of Europe all expected to follow Franz Joseph. But Franz Ferdinand had married Countess Sophie Chotek, a woman of high birth by any normal standard, but of insufficient dynastic rank by Habsburg reckoning, and the marriage was morganatic, which meant their children were legally excluded from the succession. When the bullet struck, the inheritance fell not to Franz Ferdinand's sons, but sideways to Charles. And Charles was 26 years old, already married, already a father, and entirely unprepared for what was coming. 2 years later, on November 21st, 1916, Franz Joseph died. He was 86, he had reigned for 68 years, and Charles, at 29, inherited an empire already devouring itself. Zita of Bourbon-Parma, the woman Charles had married on October 21st, 1911, at the church of Schwarzau am Steinfeld, brought something to the union that would prove more consequential than her intelligence, her considerable political instinct, or even her faith. She brought precedent, a template for what to do when the world you were born to rule no longer exists. Zita was born on May 9th, 1892, at Villa Pianore in the province of Lucca, Tuscany, one of 24 children of the dispossessed Duke Robert I of Parma and his second wife, Infanta Maria Antonia of Portugal. That word, dispossessed, is the key to everything she would later become, and it requires a moment of attention. The Bourbon-Parma family had lost their duchy in 1859, swept away by Italian unification. Zita's father had been duke of a territory that no longer existed. She grew up inside a household that already knew, in its bones, what it meant to live after political loss, to carry a title referring to a sovereignty that the world no longer recognized, to raise children in the habits and manners and languages of a court that had no country underneath it, to treat dynastic consciousness not as nostalgia for something gone, but as active daily discipline, a faith maintained against the evidence. She was educated at a Salesian convent in Zangberg, Bavaria, and later on the Isle of Wight. She spoke French, Italian, German, Spanish, Portuguese, and English. She was, by temperament and by formation, iron-willed, politically astute, incapable of self-pity, and utterly certain that dynastic legitimacy did not expire simply because a parliament or a revolution or an invading army voted to end it. What distinguished Zita from a merely stubborn woman clinging to lost status was the precision of her conviction. She did not simply believe the Habsburgs deserved their throne. She believed, as a matter of Catholic political theology, that the throne was theirs by a right that no earthly legislature could revoke. That belief was not decoration, it was structure. It would organize her household, her children's education, her political correspondence, and her daily life for the next 67 years. There is something about that detail worth sitting with for a moment. The woman who would raise Habsburg children for a lost throne had herself been raised by a family already living in the aftermath of exactly that kind of loss. Exile, for Zita, was not a catastrophe that arrived without warning or precedent. It was an inheritance. She had been formed by it before she knew she would need it. And when the moment came, she did not improvise from nothing. She reproduced what she already knew. The pattern would repeat. A dispossessed mother raises her children for a world that no longer exists, and the children absorb the discipline without being able to test it against reality. That is the generational echo at the center of this story. It did not begin with the fall of the Habsburg Empire. It began a generation earlier in an Italian duchy that had already vanished. Charles and Zita's first child, Otto, was born on November 20th, 1912, at Villa Wartholz in Reichenau in der Rax. He was the central child, not merely the firstborn son, but the repository of the entire dynastic project. Everything the family would become after the empire's end would be organized around him. His education, his formation, his languages, his political understanding, his moral instruction, his daily routine, all of it designed not to prepare him for the world as it was, but for the world as the family believed it ought to be. That meant being schooled in the history of the house, in the constitutional structures of the vanished monarchy, in the Catholic theology that underpinned the dynasty's claims, in the languages of peoples he might never govern, and in the bearing and manner of a sovereign who had no sovereignty to exercise. He was, from very early childhood, a boy carrying a role that had nowhere to exist. He would later take a doctorate at the Catholic University of Leuven. He would write and publish in multiple languages. He would become a journalist, an anti-Nazi exile activist, a European parliamentarian, and eventually one of the grand old men of the pan-European movement. But all of that came after the childhood. And the childhood was the thing that had to be carried, reckoned with, negotiated, and in a crisis that would convulse Austrian politics for years, formally surrendered. Adelheid, born January 3rd, 1914, was the eldest daughter and one of the children old enough to hold fragments of the imperial years in memory. She never married. Her adulthood remained inside the orbit of the family, close to Zita, close to the household's rhythms. When she died in 1971, the old legal restrictions on Habsburg entry to Austria still cast their shadow, and the question of what Adelheid's life might have been outside the orbit went with her to the grave. Robert, born February 8th, 1915, at Schönbrunn itself, was assigned the Austria-Este line, one of the dynastic sub-branches the family maintained even in collapse. Because even without a throne, the Habsburgs thought in terms of houses, successions, and future marriages. His descendants would later connect the family to the Belgian royal house, giving the story a genealogical afterlife, still unfolding today. Felix, born May 1st, 1916, developed early a fierce and stubborn temperament that would make him, decades later, the sibling who refused to sign away what the Austrian Republic demanded he renounce. He would hold out longer than Otto himself. He would die in 2011, the last surviving child of the last emperor, in Mexico City, still carrying the weight of a question he had never been willing to let go. Karl Ludwig, born March 10th, 1918, arrived in the empire's final year and would spend his adulthood in the forms of modernity his birth was supposed to have rendered unnecessary, studying at Leuven and at Université Laval in Quebec, filing American enlistment papers, building a civilian career with no palace behind him and no court around him. Rudolf, born September 5th, 1919, in Prangen, Switzerland, was the first child born entirely in exile, a fact that matters symbolically because it marks the dividing line in the family between those who remembered and those who did not. Charlotte, born March 1st, 1921, would in adulthood take the name Charlotte de Bar, study economics in Quebec, and write her doctoral dissertation on displaced persons served by Catholic charities in New York. That detail alone is worth the price of the story. A woman born into the language of empire, spending her working life inside the bureaucratic reality of refugees and displacement. The entire thesis of this documentary compressed into a single biography. And Elizabeth, born May 31st, 1922, 2 months after her father's death on Madeira, was the posthumous child. She never saw the father whose absence governed the household. She never knew the court. She knew only the discipline that had been erected in their place. 8 children in 10 years. The first 4 born inside the empire, the last 4 born in its aftermath. The same mother, the same household myth. very different relationships to its weight. Beyond them, names that belong to later chapters, but that should begin to register now. Regina of Saxe-Meiningen, born in 1925, who would marry Otto in 1951 and give him a domestic life not wholly defined by Zita's political theology. Karl, their son, born in 1961, now 65 years old, the current head of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, who has built a public career around Europe, cultural heritage, and memory. Georg, Karl's brother, born in 1964, now 61, who serves today as Hungary's ambassador to Spain. The dynasty did not end. It changed form, but the form it took was shaped entirely by what happened to the children who lost everything. The marriage of Charles and Zita in October 1911 was a genuine attachment inside a dynastic framework, and the speed with which the children arrived tells its own story of a household formed under pressure and sustained by conviction. Otto in 1912, Adelheid in 1914, the same year as Sarajevo born in January, 6 months before the assassination that would destroy the world she entered. Robert in 1915, while the Great War was already consuming the empire's strength on two fronts. Felix in 1916, the year of Charles's accession, 4 children in 4 years, born into nurseries that still operated under the full ceremonial apparatus of imperial court life, governesses appointed by the court-martial's office, wet nurses vetted according to tradition, household staff in livery, daily mass attended by the family, multilingual instruction beginning before the children could properly read. The rhythm of court life continued around the babies as if the outside world were not on fire. That was the point. The court existed to demonstrate continuity. The babies were continuity made flesh. For a brief, luminous period, the family appeared to stand inside the old dynastic logic exactly as the logic demanded. Sovereign on the throne, consort at his side, heir in the nursery, the succession secure, the household turning as it had always turned. On December 30th, 1916, the logic reached its most visible expression. Charles was crowned King of Hungary at the Matthias Church on Castle Hill in Buda, with the full weight of medieval ceremony behind the event, the holy crown of St. Stephen placed on his head, the coronation oath administered before the assembled dignitaries, the ancient procession through the streets of Budapest. Otto was 4 years old. He was dressed in white Hungarian court costume, a miniature figure placed inside a spectacle designed to show the world that succession was assured. The photographs from that day are among the most valuable images in the entire story. They show the precise moment at which the old system was still performing its own continuation. Father on the throne, child at his side, the machinery of inheritance doing what it had done for centuries. There is no uncertainty in those pictures. There is no visible doubt. There is only a small boy in costume beside a young king, both of them framed by a ritual that assumed they would always be there. Behind that image, the reality was already breaking. Charles had inherited a war he could not win and a state he could not hold together. Austria-Hungary's armies were overstretched across the Italian front, the Eastern Front, and a dozen subsidiary conflicts. Its nationalities were growing restive as the war dragged on, and Wilson's rhetoric of self-determination filled the air. Its economy was deteriorating under blockade and attrition. Charles wanted peace. He wanted it with the sincerity of a man whose faith told him that unnecessary suffering was a sin, and Zita helped him reach for it. Through her brother Prince Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma, the imperial couple opened secret negotiations with France in early 1917, attempting to find a way out of the German alliance and the war it had produced. The Sixtus affair, when it was later exposed by the French Premier Clemenceau in April 1918, humiliated Charles before his German allies and made the dynasty appear not merely weakened but duplicitous. Charles was forced into a public denial that everyone in diplomatic circles knew to be false. His position as sovereign became, from that moment, a kind of performance sustained by nothing more than institutional inertia and the absence of an alternative. The private dimension of those months is what matters for this story. A young husband and wife trying simultaneously to end a continental war, preserve a crumbling state, manage the expectations of a court that still expected grandeur, and raise very small children in rooms that still looked like the center of the world but were already becoming the scenery for a performance that would not be staged again. Zita later said she had known, even as she helped engineer the Sixtus negotiations, that the odds were against them. She did it anyway. That combination, clear-eyed assessment and action regardless, was the quality she would bring to everything that followed. Karl Ludwig was born in March 1918, 7 months before the end. By the autumn, the empire was dissolving. National councils in Prague, Zagreb, and Budapest declared independence one by one. The army disintegrated. On November 11, 1918, at Schönbrunn Palace, Charles signed a proclamation in which he renounced all participation in the affairs of state. The wording was meticulous. He did not use the word abdication. He never used the word abdication. That distinction, seemingly a piece of legalistic hair splitting, would haunt his children for half a century because it left the dynastic claim alive. In theology, in law, and in the minds of everyone who wanted to believe the story was not finished. 2 days later, the family left Schönbrunn for Schloss Eckartsau, a hunting lodge in the marshlands east of Vienna that became a strange liminal waiting room between sovereignty and expulsion. The staff was reduced to a skeleton. The supplies were uncertain. At points, Strutt personally organized food deliveries because the new authorities were content to let the former imperial family go without. The local population was hostile or indifferent. Armed soldiers from the new republic's forces appeared at the gates. The children continued their routines inside walls that no longer meant what they had meant a month earlier. A British officer named Colonel Edward Liesl Strutt arrived with provisions, medicines, and the implicit backing of George Thief to ensure the family was treated humanely. Strutt was a practical man, a soldier and mountaineer, and his letters from this period describe a household suspended between dignity and disintegration. The former emperor still addressed by his staff with the old courtesies. The former empress managing the nursery with her characteristic discipline. The children playing in the gardens of a lodge whose function had changed from imperial retreat to holding pen. Otto was 6 years old, Adelheid was 4, Robert was 3, Felix was 2, Karl Ludwig was 11 months. And then on March 24th, 1919, under Strutt's escort, they boarded a train and left Austria. The Habsburg law followed within weeks. On April 3, 1919, the new Austrian Republic passed legislation that legally stripped the dynasty of ruling rights, expropriated crown property, and established the basis for permanent exile. Any member of the House, born before the law's effective date, who refused to renounce their claims and declare loyalty to the Republic would be barred from Austrian soil indefinitely. The family's titles were abolished. The name itself became a legal problem, something the state would regulate, argue over, and attempt to erase from the public vocabulary. In a single act of parliament, the state that the Habsburgs had built declared that the Habsburgs were the one thing the state could no longer tolerate: the children's public identity, their names, their titles, their legal standing, their very right to exist on Austrian territory, was now something a hostile government would regulate, contest, and if necessary, deny. That law would shadow every child in this story. It would determine who could enter Austria and who could not. It would dictate the terms under which Otto, decades later, could return to the country his family had ruled for 6 centuries. And it would produce, in 1971, a detail so small and so devastating that it belongs at the end of this story rather than here. The household that had been constructed for succession was now a household in exile. Switzerland first, temporary, uncertain, financed by fragments of the old world's goodwill and the charity of those who still believed in the cause. Then a Portuguese island, where the climate was kind and the distance from Europe was vast enough to feel like erasure. Then a hilltop house called Quinta do Monte, where damp air came off the Atlantic and the rooms were rented and the furniture belonged to strangers, and where the father would die at 34 and the mother 29 and pregnant with her 8th child, would take the remnants of an empire and remake them into a program for children who would spend their lives trying to live up to it. That is the next chapter, and it is the one that shapes every life in this story for the rest of the century. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew, and we're only just beginning. Switzerland was not refuge. It was suspension. The family arrived in March 1919 and settled first at Wartegg Castle on Lake Constance, a property lent by a relative, then moved to the Villa Prangens near Nyon on the shore of Lake Geneva. The houses were adequate. The setting was beautiful, lights, still water, mountains, clean air, the ordered calm of a country that had kept itself out of the war that had destroyed the family's world, and none of it belonged to them. The former emperor of Austro-Hungary, king of a dozen peoples, apostolic majesty, was now a guest in borrowed rooms in a neutral country that had no intention of involving itself in the question of his future. The Swiss government tolerated the family's presence on the condition that Charles refrained from political activity, a condition that would prove impossible to sustain. The children played in gardens that were not theirs. The household staff, reduced from the hundreds who had maintained the court to a handful of loyal followers, attempted to preserve what routines they could: morning prayers, lessons, the forms of address that the children had been taught before they could read. Zita organized the household with the same discipline she would have applied at Schönbrunn, but the context had changed so fundamentally that the discipline now floated free of its original purpose, a set of habits performing a world that no longer existed outside the nursery walls. There was no court to dress for. There was no government to advise. There was no empire to represent. There was only a family, a claim, and a set of increasingly tenuous connections to the political networks that might, if the right conditions held, make restoration possible. What kept the claim alive in those early Swiss years was the stubborn legal fact that Charles had not abdicated. That careful piece of language, the withdrawal from participation in affairs of state, not the renunciation of the crown, created an ambiguity on which everything else rested. For legitimists in Austria and Hungary, it meant the dynasty's rights were merely suspended, not extinguished. For Catholic theologians sympathetic to the cause, it meant the coronation oath still held. Charles had received the crown from God through the ceremony and through the constitution, and he could not unilaterally hand it back to a parliament that had no authority to receive it. For Charles himself, the non-abdication was not a legal technicality, it was a moral obligation. And for the children, it meant that the family's situation was understood. Inside the household, not as defeat, but as waiting. They were not the children of a deposed ruler, making the best of reduced circumstances. They were the children of an emperor in temporary exile. And the exile would end when history corrected itself. That belief was tested twice in 1921, and both tests made the situation worse. In the spring, Charles traveled secretly from Switzerland to Budapest to attempt the restoration of the Hungarian throne. Hungary, under the regency of Admiral Miklos Horthy, had been functioning since 1920 as a kingdom without a king, a constitutional arrangement of exquisite absurdity that suited nearly everyone except the man who believed the crown was rightfully his. Horthy had been appointed regent with the understanding, at least in legitimist circles, that the arrangement was transitional. Charles arrived in Budapest expecting to find the ground prepared for his return. He found instead hesitation, evasion, and the blunt reality of international opposition. The little Entente powers, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia, had made clear that a Habsburg restoration would be treated as a provocation requiring a military response. Horthy, whatever his private sympathies, was unwilling to risk a war. Charles was persuaded to leave. He returned to Switzerland diminished but unbroken, and the household absorbed the failure as a setback, not a verdict. The children were told nothing, or were told only what Zita decided they should hear. But the mood of the household after that first attempt, the deflation, the recalculation, the stiffening of resolve, would have been impossible to hide from a child as alert as Otto. The second attempt, in October 1921, was bolder, more desperate, and more damaging. Charles flew from Switzerland to Western Hungary and this time tried to march on Budapest with a small force of loyal troops. Zita accompanied him, a detail that matters because it shows the degree to which she understood the cause as a joint enterprise, not merely her husband's private obsession. The children were left behind in Switzerland in the care of staff. Otto was 8 years old. He knew his parents had gone to Hungary. He knew what they were attempting. Whether he understood the danger is unclear, but the household's tension would have been unmistakable. Charles and Zita advanced by train and motor car toward the capital, gathering a modest column of supporters as they went. For a few hours, it looked as though the venture might succeed. Troops rallied, the column grew, and the road to Budapest seemed open. Then Horthy's forces blocked the route near Budars. Shots were exchanged, men were wounded. The column halted. The international response was immediate and fierce. The little Entente mobilized, Britain protested, the Conference of Ambassadors demanded that Charles be removed from any position where further attempts were possible. Charles and Zita were detained, separated from the children for weeks, and handed over to British custody aboard HMS Glowworm on the Danube. They were taken to the Black Sea and from there conveyed to their final exile. The consequence was banishment not merely from Austria, but from Europe's center altogether. The Allied powers decided the family must be sent somewhere from which restoration attempts would be physically impossible. That place was Madeira. The Portuguese island sits in the Atlantic, roughly 600 miles southwest of Lisbon, closer to the coast of Morocco than to any European capital. It was chosen for its remoteness. Charles and Zita arrived in November 1921 with their children. Otto, now 9 years old, Adelheid, Robert, Felix, Carl Ludwig, Rudolf, and Charlotte, who was 8 months old. They were installed first at the Villa Victoria in Funchal, a hotel on the seafront that was comfortable enough but costly. The household's finances were by now a source of constant anxiety. The old court revenues were gone. The Austrian assets had been confiscated under the Habsburg law. What money remained came from several fragile sources: the sporadic generosity of monarchist sympathizers across Europe, fragments of the Hungarian crown domain that the Horthy regime made available to Zita despite having blocked her husband's return, and the personal charity of Alfonso XIII of Spain, who regarded the Habsburg cause with genuine sympathy and who had provided material assistance since the earliest days of exile. It was not enough. By early 1922, the family could no longer afford the Villa Victoria and moved uphill to Quinta do Monte, a rented house in the village of Monte above Funchal. Reached by a steep winding road through subtropical vegetation, the house was adequate in size but in no way equipped for a former imperial family. The rooms were damp. The heating was poor, especially in the cooler months when Atlantic weather rolled in off the ocean and the walls sweated with moisture. The furniture belonged to the landlord. The kitchen was modest. The garden, terraced into the hillside, was pleasant enough for the children: subtropical flowers, views of the sea, paths between banana plants and vines. But the sense of improvisation was inescapable. This was a house rented by a family running out of options, not a residence chosen for its dignity. The local population was courteous but indifferent. Funchal was a small town. The arrival of a deposed emperor and his family was a curiosity, not an event that altered anyone's daily life. The children attended mass at the local church. They played in the garden. They were taken on walks along the steep roads that connected Monte to the town below. Their lives had the outward appearance of a quiet domestic holiday on an Atlantic island, except that the quietness was enforced by exile, and the island was a prison in all but name. Otto, at 9, was old enough to understand the outlines of the situation: that his father had been emperor, that the empire had fallen, that the restoration attempts had failed, and that the adults around him spoke of return with a seriousness that was not play acting, but that had no clear path to fulfillment. Adelheid, at 7, was old enough to sense the household's anxiety without fully comprehending its source. The younger children understood less and less the further down the line you went. Felix was 5, Karl Ludwig was 3, Rudolf was 2, Charlotte was a baby. For them, Madeira was simply where they lived, and the palaces were stories, not memories. That gap between the children who carried direct experience and the children who carried only what they had been told would widen with every year that passed. In February 1922, Charles went into Funchal on foot. The weather was wet. He was inadequately dressed for it, and the family could not afford to replace worn clothing easily. And Charles, by temperament, was not a man who attended to his own physical comfort when other concerns pressed. He caught cold. The cold settled. Within days, it had moved into his chest, and the bronchitis that developed in a man already weakened by the accumulated strains of war, political failure, 2 botched restoration attempts, and the damp conditions of the house progressed rapidly into pneumonia. The medical resources available on Madeira in 1922 were limited. The local doctors attended him. They could do very little. Zita nursed him herself, as she had nursed him through illness before, but this time the fever did not break and the breathing did not improve. Through the second half of March, the household contracted around the sick room. The children were kept close but shielded from the worst of it. The few remaining staff moved quietly through the corridors. Letters went out to the continent requesting assistance that could not arrive in time. April 1st, 1922, Quinta do Monte, a rented house on a hillside above Funchal, surrounded by laurel and eucalyptus, the sea visible below through the morning mist. Charles was 34 years old. He had been ill for weeks. His breathing was labored. The room smelled of sickness and of the medicines that had failed to halt it. Zita was beside him. She was 29. She was pregnant with their 8th child. The priest had administered the last sacraments, and Otto was brought in. Otto was 9 years old. He stood beside his father's bed. Whether Charles spoke to him, whether there were specific words of instruction or farewell, it depends on the account. Some sources say Charles called Otto to him and told him to carry on the work. Others record the scene more quietly: a dying man, a small boy, a gesture. What is not in dispute is the meaning the family drew from that moment. The dying emperor had commended his son to the cause. The father's last act was to transfer, not a crown. He had no crown to give, but the expectation that the son would live as if the crown still mattered. Charles died in the early afternoon. Zita remained beside him. The household entered a grief that was immediate and devastating, but that was never, even for a moment, permitted to become merely private. Charles was not mourned as an ordinary husband and father. He was mourned as a sovereign who had died in the service of God and his peoples, a man whose suffering in exile was understood within the family's theology as a form of martyrdom. That interpretation would be maintained by Zita for the rest of her life. It would eventually find formal expression in the Catholic Church's beatification process, opened decades later, in which Charles would be declared blessed, a man who had lived and died in heroic virtue. For the children, the consequence was that their father was elevated almost immediately from a parent they had known into a figure they were required to honor. His goodness hardened into doctrine. His memory became a standard against which their own lives would be measured. He was 34, Zita was 29, and the program that would govern the next several decades of the children's lives began not with a political decision, but with a death in a rented room. The funeral was modest in a way that makes the contrast with the family's former life almost unbearable. The coffin left Quinta do Monte and was carried down the steep road to the church of Nossa Senhora do Monte, the pilgrimage church above Funchal. The road was narrow and wound through gardens of bougainvillea and hydrangea. The pallbearers were not soldiers of a guard regiment or officials of a vanished court. They were the men who had followed the family into exile and who had stayed when almost everyone else had found reason to leave. Photographs from the day show Zita in full mourning black, her face controlled, Otto walking beside her in a dark suit. The smaller children in a line behind the coffin, Adelheid holding a younger sibling's hand, Felix walking with the concentrated seriousness of a 5-year-old who has been told to be quiet. The procession is tiny. The setting is a hillside church in the subtropics, not a state cathedral in Vienna or Budapest. No military guard, no lying in state, no representatives of foreign powers filing past the catafalque, no cannon, no state mourning, just a widow, her children, a priest, and the handful of exiled courtiers who had followed the family to the end of the road. Charles was interred in the church. He remains there today. His body was never brought back to Austria. He is still, more than a century later, in exile. The days that followed the funeral were the crucible. Zita was alone in a way she had not been since childhood. She was 29, pregnant, responsible for 7 children between the ages of 1 and 9, financially precarious, politically abandoned, and living on an island from which departure required the permission of foreign governments. The household continued to function because Zita made it function. Morning prayers continued. Lessons continued. The children's routines were maintained with an almost ferocious consistency, as if the regularity itself were a bulwark against the chaos that surrounded it. It was, in its way, an act of extraordinary defiance. The world had taken the crown, the country, the palaces, the money, and now the husband. Zita responded by refusing to let the world take the structure. In the weeks that followed, Zita made the decision that would shape every child's life. She could have retreated into private grief. She could have accepted the verdict of history, that the empire was finished, that the dynasty was finished, that the task now was simply to raise 8 children as well as possible, under straitened circumstances, and allow them to find their own way in a changed world. She could have married again. She could have sought quiet obscurity in a sympathetic country. She did the opposite. She treated Charles's death not as the end of the cause, but as its intensification. The father was gone. The household must become the vehicle for continuation. The children, above all Otto, must be formed for the role history had interrupted, not abandoned. That decision, taken by a 29-year-old widow in borrowed rooms on an Atlantic island with almost no money and no guarantee of welcome anywhere in Europe, is the moment the private family story fully separates from the political one. From this point forward, the empire survives only as curriculum, the throne survives only as household discipline, and the children will pay for both. Elizabeth was born on May 31st, 1922, at El Pardo near Madrid. The family had already begun to move back to the continent. Alfonso XIII arranged passage from Madeira and offered the household his protection, the protection of a king who still had a throne, extended to a family that had lost theirs. Elizabeth was the posthumous child, born 2 months after her father's death, into a family already reorganizing itself around the program his death had produced. She was the daughter who would never know what the others at least partly remembered. She would never know the father's voice, the father's face, except in photographs, the particular quality of his gentleness that the older children could recall. She would know only the reverence with which his name was spoken, and the discipline that reverence required. In a household where the dead father was more present than most living ones, Elizabeth would spend her childhood in the company of a ghost she had never met. By the summer of 1922, the family was in the Basque country. Alfonso Turtuin provided access to the Palacio Urbaran in Lacatio, a solid stone house on the Bay of Biscay, and Zita turned it into the first durable exile household. The daily regime she established there was not improvised, it was engineered. Morning mass, breakfast in order of age, academic lessons throughout the morning, conducted by tutors and a governess, selected not merely for their teaching qualifications, but for their sympathy to the cause and their willingness to maintain the forms of accord that no longer existed. French, German, Italian, and Hungarian. History, the family's history, the empire's history, the Catholic history of European sovereignty. Mathematics, political theory for the older children. Geography taught through the lens of the territories the family had once ruled. Religious instruction daily. The afternoon offered more freedom. The children played in the garden, walked to the harbor, explored the Bay of Biscay shoreline. But even the leisure hours carried the imprint of the household's purpose. The children addressed each other by their proper titles. The etiquette of the old court was maintained in miniature. Visitors, exiled courtiers, sympathetic clergy, members of other dispossessed European houses were received with a formality that would have been natural at the Habsburg and that at Lacatio acquired a quality that was either deeply impressive or faintly surreal, depending on whether you believed the family still had a future. Governess diaries and tutor correspondence from these years survive, which means the private texture of Lacatio is unusually accessible. The children were not miserable. That matters, because the story could be told as pure oppression and it would be dishonest. There was warmth at Lacatio. There was sea air and play in the ordinary comedy of a large family with children ranging from infancy to early adolescence. Charlotte was a toddler exploring the garden. Felix was boisterous and physical, the kind of child who needed the sea to run off his energy. Otto was serious beyond his years, already carrying himself with a gravity that the household both encouraged and depended upon. Adelheid was quiet, devout, and close to Zita, the daughter who absorbed the maternal atmosphere most completely and who would remain inside its orbit for the rest of her life. Robert, at 7 and 8, was beginning to display the steady, dutiful temperament that would later make him the most reliably dynastic of the brothers. The younger ones, and Karl Ludwig, Rudolf, Elizabeth, were simply children, too small to understand the program that surrounded them, absorbing its rhythms through repetition rather than comprehension. But the warmth operated within a framework that left no room for the children to question the household's founding assumptions. They were Habsburgs. They were the heirs to a vanished empire. Their father had died for the cause. Their mother was keeping the cause alive. Their duty was to be worthy of both. No child in that household could opt out of the family narrative. No child could say, even silently, that the empire was finished and the future lay elsewhere. The narrative was the air they breathe. An air is not something a child negotiates with. Otto bore the heaviest share of that expectation, and by the mid-1920s, the shape of his formation was unmistakable. He was not simply the eldest son getting a good education. He was the heir being prepared for office, an office that no longer existed in political reality, but that existed with total conviction inside the household. His curriculum was deeper, broader, and more demanding than his siblings. His reading was directed toward the history and constitutional structure of the Habsburg lands. His languages were more rigorously drilled. By his teenage years, he could operate in German, French, Hungarian, Croatian, Spanish, and English with the confidence of someone who had been speaking them since early childhood. His bearing was observed and corrected by the adults around him. He was taught to receive visitors with the gravity appropriate to a future sovereign. He was taught to sit at the head of the table when Zita indicated to represent the family at religious and social occasions, and to carry himself as though the title that had been legally stripped from the family still adhered to him by a right that no republic could remove. The expectation was that Otto would be ready when the time came to assume the responsibilities of a sovereign. The fact that no sovereignty was available for him to assume did not diminish the intensity of the preparation. If anything, the absence of the throne made the preparation more urgent because without it, the household had no justification for existing in the form Zita had given it. By 1929, the household had outgrown what Lacatio could provide. Otto was approaching 17 and needed a university. Zita chose the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, and the family relocated to Ham Castle in Steenokert, near Brussels, a moated manor house set among flat Flemish fields. Its walls reflected in still water, its rooms large enough to accommodate the family and the remnants of the court that still attended them. Ham Castle became the base of operations for the next phase of the project, and in some ways it was the place where the project most clearly revealed its contradictions. The household retained its court-like character, old followers who had served Charles, clerical advisors who saw in Otto the future Catholic sovereign of Central Europe, visiting aristocrats who treated Zita with the deference due to an empress, and staff loyal to the memory of the dead emperor and the cause his widow embodied. The daily routine was formal. Visitors were received with protocol. Letters arrived from legitimist organizations across Central Europe. And outside the moat, the 1930s were arriving. The depression grinding through Europe, fascism rising in Italy and Germany, the political order that had replaced the Habsburg Empire itself beginning to crack. The family existed in two time zones simultaneously. The vanished world preserved inside the household, and the darkening continent visible through the windows. Money remained improvised and uncertain, part of it from the Hungarian crown domain of Rakev, part from sympathizers, part from the quiet generosity of those who still believed. The irony was not lost on anyone paying attention. The dynasty that Horthy had refused to restore was still being partially sustained by the political system that had refused to restore it. And the system that had replaced the Habsburgs was beginning to produce something far worse than anything the old empire had contained. Otto turned 18 on November 20th, 1930, and the date carried a significance that went far beyond a birthday. In dynastic terms, his majority meant the cause could now be carried in his own name. He was no longer a minor represented by his mother. He was, in the eyes of every legitimist in Central Europe, the head of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine. He had not chosen that role. It had been chosen for him by his birth, his father's death, and his mother's refusal to accept that the choice could be unmade. The question that would define the rest of Otto's life was now formally his. Whether to live as the pretender his mother had raised him to be, or to find some other use for the languages, the learning, the discipline, and the political intelligence that her program had produced. He would spend the next 30 years suspended between those options, and the suspension itself would become a kind of identity. He enrolled at Leuven and proved to be an exceptional student, intellectually rigorous, multilingual, capable of writing and arguing in French, German, English, Hungarian, and Spanish, with a fluency that reflected not natural talent alone, but the years of formation at Lacatio and Steenokert. He took his doctorate in political and social sciences in 1935. He began writing articles and essays for Catholic and conservative publications. He cultivated contacts among politicians, journalists, diplomats, and intellectuals across Europe. He was not merely studying, he was building the network that would sustain him for the next 70 years. A network that began in legitimist circles, but that would eventually extend into the pan-European movement, into the post-war Christian democratic establishment, and into the institutions of European integration. What Zita had intended as preparation for a restored throne was becoming, without anyone quite acknowledging it, preparation for something else entirely. The siblings, meanwhile, were quietly diverging. Robert took on the Austria-Este line with a sense of dynastic duty that felt natural rather than forced. Felix sharpened his refusal into something closer to principle than temperament. He would not bend, would not sign, would not accept a compromise that his mother's theology told him was illegitimate. Karl, Ludwig, and Rudolf moved toward lives that would eventually involve study in Quebec, military service under foreign flags, and the practical anonymity of a world that did not need archdukes. Charlotte and Elizabeth grew under the same roof, absorbed the same values, and would eventually take those values into lives so different from each other's. One into social work among refugees under an assumed name, one into marriage with a reigning prince, that the family's unity began to look less like a shared program and more like a shared starting point from which everyone walked in a different direction. The decade between Otto's majority and the fall of Belgium was the last period in which the family existed as a single, disciplined household, united under one roof and one purpose. Otto, by the late 1930s, had become one of the most prominent anti-Nazi voices in exile, a position that earned him the personal enmity of the regime and placed the entire family on a list that the Gestapo had every intention of acting upon. He had argued publicly for Austrian independence. He had worked behind the scenes to resist the Anschluss. He had been, in effect, the last significant public figure still insisting that Austria was not merely a province of Germany, but a nation with its own identity and its own legitimate ruling house. The Nazis considered him dangerous, which was, in its way, the final confirmation that Zita's program had produced exactly what she intended, a man the world took seriously. It would not survive what came next. By May 1940, the Wehrmacht was in Belgium. The Gestapo was hunting for Habsburg names, and the family was running again through collapsing France, through the Pyrenees, through Spain, through Portugal, and across the Atlantic to a continent where nobody had any use for an emperor's children, and where the dynasty's survival would depend not on the dream of restoration, but on something Zita had never planned for, the invention of entirely new lives. That flight and what it cost each of them is where the story turns. The Anschluss came first, and it was not a surprise to Otto. On March 12, 1938, German troops crossed the Austrian border and annexed the country without meaningful resistance. The Habsburg homeland, the country the family had ruled for 6 centuries and been exiled from for 19 years, ceased to exist as an independent state. It became overnight the Ostmark, a province of Hitler's Reich. For the children who had been raised on the expectation of eventual return, the Anschluss was not simply a political event. It was the destruction of the destination, the country they had been educated to lead, the country whose history they had studied at kitchen tables in Leketio and in classrooms at Steenokkerziel, the country whose languages they had been drilled in and whose constitutional structures they had been taught to understand, was now absorbed into the very regime their eldest brother had spent years publicly opposing. Otto from Belgium had done everything in his power to prevent it. He had lobbied Western governments. He had written and spoken and argued that Austria's independence was a European necessity, not merely a Habsburg interest. He had offered himself with a directness that startled some observers and appalled others as a rallying point for Austrian resistance, arguing that a restored constitutional monarchy might provide the only political framework strong enough to withstand annexation. He was ignored. The British and French, already committed to the policy of appeasement that would reach its most catastrophic expression at Munich later that year, had no appetite for a Habsburg solution to the Austrian question. The Americans were not yet in the picture, and the Austrians themselves were deeply divided, some horrified, some euphoric, most simply overwhelmed by the speed of events. The Anschluss happened in hours. Years of exile, preparation, and lobbying were rendered meaningless in an afternoon. The throne Zita had spent 16 years preserving in miniature was now not merely vacant but buried beneath a regime that considered the Habsburgs enemies of the German state. What the Anschluss also did, with immediate practical effect, was place every member of the Habsburg family on a German target list. Otto had been stripped of Austrian citizenship by the Habsburg law years earlier. Now the country whose citizenship he had been denied was itself inside the Reich, and the Reich considered him personally dangerous. His name appeared on arrest warrants. His writings were banned. His contacts across Central Europe were now operating inside occupied territory. The family at Steenokkerziel was, for the first time since Charles's death, in direct physical danger. Not the danger of legal banishment or financial ruin, which they had already endured, but the danger of imprisonment and potentially worse. For 2 years, that danger remained at a distance. Belgium was neutral. The household at Hamcastle continued its routines, reduced, anxious, scanning the news but still functioning. Otto divided his time between Brussels, Paris, and London, building the networks of refugee assistance and anti-Nazi political coordination that would define his wartime role. He met with British and French officials. He wrote articles. He maintained contacts with the Austrian resistance. The younger children continued their education. Zita continued to govern the household with the iron discipline that had not wavered since the day after Charles's death. But everyone in the house understood that Belgian neutrality was borrowed time. If Germany moved west, Belgium would fall. And if Belgium fell, the Gestapo would come for the Habsburgs. Germany moved west on May 10, 1940. The Wehrmacht invaded Belgium. the Netherlands, and Luxembourg simultaneously, smashing through the Ardennes and outflanking the Allied defensive lines with a speed that stunned the world. The Belgian army, the British Expeditionary Force, and the French forces in the north were overwhelmed. Within days, the front was collapsing. Within weeks, Belgium would surrender. The country that had sheltered the Habsburgs for 11 years, that had educated Otto, housed the household, provided the moated calm from which the family had managed its last stable exile, was overrun in 18 days. The family's escape is one of the most harrowing episodes in the entire story, and it should not be told as a clean departure. It was chaotic, improvised, and conducted under conditions that reduced the former imperial household to exactly the same status as every other family fleeing the German advance. Otto was in Paris when the invasion began. Zita was at Steenokkersil with the younger children. The Gestapo had standing orders, documented, specific, not speculative, to arrest any Habsburgs found in occupied territory. Otto's name was near the top of the list. The roads out of Belgium were already choked with refugees. Hundreds of thousands of civilians moving south on foot, by car, by cart, by bicycle, mixed with retreating soldiers, abandoned military vehicles, and the wreckage of a collapsing front. Luftwaffe aircraft strafed the columns. Bridges were destroyed. The distinction between military and civilian targets had ceased to exist. Into that chaos, Zita moved the household. She gathered the children. Felix was 23, Karl Ludwig was 22, Rudolf was 20, Charlotte was 19, Elizabeth was 17, Adelheid was 26, Robert was 25. These were no longer small children being bundled into a carriage. They were young adults, capable of understanding exactly what was happening and exactly what the consequences of capture would be. Zita organized what luggage could be taken. She secured transport. She made decisions under pressure with the same controlled ferocity she had displayed at every previous departure, except that this time the margin for error was measured not in weeks or days, but in hours. She had done this before. Left Schönbrunn in 1918, left Eckartsau in 1919, left Switzerland in 1921, left Madeira in 1922, left Lecatio in 1929. She knew by now, with the expertise of a woman who had spent her adult life being expelled from places, exactly what it felt like to compress a household into what could be carried. But this time, the enemy was not a republic issuing legal notices at a polite diplomatic distance. It was a mechanized army advancing at speed with a specific interest in finding anyone whose name appeared on the Gestapo's arrest list. The family fled south through France. The details of the route are not fully documented in every source, but the general trajectory is clear. From Belgium into northern France, then south and west as the German advance rolled behind them, staying ahead of the occupation by days or in some stretches by hours. The landscape through which they moved was one of civilian catastrophe. Abandoned luggage on roadsides, overturned carts, columns of refugees stretching toward the horizon, the sound of aircraft overhead. Otto, operating separately through Paris, worked to arrange transit documents, safe passages, and whatever diplomatic protection could be improvised from the contacts he had built over the previous decade. The family crossed into unoccupied France, then made its way south to the Spanish border. Spain, the country that had sheltered them once before, after Madeira, the country of Alfonso III's and Lecatio, let them through. From Spain, they reached Portugal. At Lisbon, they waited for passage across the Atlantic, joining the vast, desperate stream of European refugees, exiles, intellectuals, and political fugitives who were pouring through the Portuguese capital in the summer of 1940, all of them looking for berths on ships to the Americas. There is something about the geography of this flight that the documentary should make visible, because it tells the emotional story more clearly than any analysis could. The family had been moving westward for 22 years. Vienna to Eckartsau, Eckartsau to Switzerland, Switzerland to Madeira, Madeira to Spain, Spain to Belgium, and now Belgium to France, France to Spain, Spain to Portugal, and Portugal to the United States. Each move was further from the center. Each move was more improvised. Each move stripped another layer of the old court apparatus, another set of followers who could not make the journey, another collection of papers and photographs that had to be left behind, another house that would never be returned to. By the time they reached Lisbon, the family that had once occupied the Hofburg, employed thousands of staff, and presided over an empire of 50 million people, was a group of refugees waiting for berths on a transatlantic liner, carrying travel documents that identified them by names the New World would barely recognize. In the cafes and hotel lobbies of wartime Lisbon, they would have encountered hundreds of other refugees in the same condition. Writers, politicians, intellectuals, business people, whole families, all of them waiting, all of them carrying the remnants of lives that had been dismantled by the same forces. The Habsburg story was unique in scale and in the weight of historical memory it carried. It was not unique in kind. That is part of what makes it worth telling. The arc from Schönbrunn to Lisbon Harbor is the arc of the 20th century itself, compressed into one family's passage. They arrived in the United States in the summer of 1940, joining the extraordinary wave of European exiles, political leaders, intellectuals, artists, scientists, writers, who were remaking American cultural and political life from the outside, even as they depended on it for survival. Otto settled in Washington, where his political contacts, his multilingual fluency, and his intimate knowledge of Central European affairs allowed him to operate as what he had in effect become a stateless European exile with better connections, more languages, and a deeper historical understanding of the region than almost anyone else in the American capital. He rented rooms, he attended receptions, he wrote memoranda, he cultivated relationships with State Department officials, intelligence officers, congressional staffers, and the growing community of European exiles who understood that the war's outcome would determine not only who won, but what kind of Europe would exist after winning. Otto worked with government officials, with refugee organizations, and with the exile groups forming around the displaced governments of occupied countries. He lobbied for the restoration of Austrian independence as a post-war objective. The same argument he had been making since 1938, now reframed for American strategic thinking. He helped individual refugees navigate the American immigration bureaucracy, many of them Jewish, many of them from the old Habsburg lands, many of them people whose families had been subjects of his family's empire within living memory. He intervened where he could. He wrote letters of recommendation. He used whatever residual influence the Habsburg name still carried in Catholic and conservative circles to open doors that might otherwise have remained closed. The irony was layered and exact. The heir to a multinational empire was now doing individual casework for displaced persons in a country that had never had a monarch. But the skills Zita had spent decades developing turned out to be precisely what the moment required. The languages were useful. The political intelligence was needed. The understanding of how Central Europe's borders, nationalities, ethnic tensions, and political loyalties actually worked, knowledge that the American policy establishment was only beginning to acquire, gave Otto a role that no title could have provided and that no title could have earned. Zita, meanwhile, made a decision that illuminated the family's priorities with almost painful clarity. Rather than keeping the remaining household together in Washington or New York, where Otto was operating and where proximity to political power might have offered the family some visibility and perhaps some practical advantage, she moved the younger children to Quebec. The reason was education, specifically the linguistic and religious education, that she still considered more important than any immediate advantage proximity to American politics might provide. The younger children's French needed to be maintained and deepened, and Quebec offered a francophone Catholic environment that could continue the formation Zita still considered essential. Université Laval in Quebec City became the institution around which the younger Habsburgs' wartime years were organized. Karl Ludwig enrolled there, Charlotte enrolled there, Rudolph was there. The household reconstituted itself in the gray stone city on the St. Lawrence River, a continent away from everything the family had known, and the daily routine continued: mass, study, languages, Catholic observance, in rooms that bore no resemblance to any space the dynasty had previously inhabited. The Quebec years are among the most quietly devastating in the entire story because they show the program running in conditions that expose its fundamental displacement. Zita was maintaining the formation of children intended for the governance of a Central European empire. She was doing it in French Canada during a world war, on money that came from charitable donations and the diminishing reserves of legitimate sympathy. The children studied economics, political science, and modern languages at a provincial university in a country that had no connection to their history, no memory of their name, and no interest in their claims. They attended Mass at local churches where the liturgy was the same, but everything surrounding it, the language of the street, the architecture, the food, the weather, the social assumptions of the parishioners around them, was utterly foreign to the world that had produced them. They lived in rented rooms. They walked to lectures in the cold. They ate what they could afford. The court etiquette that had been maintained at Licatio and at Stenokerzeel was now finally impossible to sustain in any recognizable external form. There were no visitors from dispossessed European houses. There were no clerical advisers debating the theology of legitimate succession over dinner. There was no moat. There was Quebec City in winter, gray stone and snow and the frozen St. Lawrence, and a set of young people who happened to be the children of the last emperor of Austria-Hungary, studying alongside Canadian students who had never heard of the Hofburg and who would not have believed the story if they had. What remained was the interior version of the program, the values, the faith, the consciousness of identity, the shared understanding among the siblings, that what they were doing was temporary, and that the world they had been educated for still existed somewhere, in some form, waiting for the correction that would restore it. The architecture was gone, the rooms were gone, the staff was gone, the furniture was rented, the borrowed villas and moated castles of the European years had been replaced by the plainest possible version of Catholic student life. Only the belief persisted. And belief without architecture, without ceremony, without the daily reinforcement of a household organized to embody it, becomes something different. It becomes habit or memory or faith in the religious sense, held not because the evidence supports it, but because letting go would mean admitting that the sacrifice was for nothing. Carl Ludwig's wartime trajectory shows what adaptation looked like when it was stripped of all insulation. He studied at Laval and then attempted to enlist in the United States Army. An emperor's son, born in the final year of the empire, educated in exile across 4 countries and 2 continents, walked into an American recruiting office and filled out paperwork under a name that meant nothing to the officer across the desk. He was not enlisting as an archduke. He was enlisting as a man without a country, without an estate, without independent income, and with a set of languages, manners, and historical knowledge that the American military had neither requested nor prepared for. The forms asked for nationality, and he had none to give. Or rather, the nationality he might have claimed had been legally abolished before he was old enough to exercise it. He served. The details of his wartime service are not extensively documented in the sources available, but the fact of it carries an emotional weight that does not require elaboration. A child of the Hofburg, raised on the memory of the Hungarian coronation, son of the man who had worn the crown of St. Stephen, was now subject to the physical examinations, the drills, the regulations, and the impersonal bureaucracy of a Republican army that could not have cared less about the Habsburg succession. The distance between what Carl Ludwig had been raised to be and what the world now required him to become was, at that moment, as vast as it would be for any of the siblings. Charlotte's trajectory deserves the most sustained attention of all the siblings' wartime stories because it represents the most complete transformation of the dynastic inheritance into something the outside world could actually use. She studied economics at Laval. She learned the methodology of social casework. She moved to New York. And at some point during the transition from wartime student to working professional, she made a decision that none of her siblings made in quite the same way. She adopted the name Charlotte de Bar, shedding the Habsburg identification entirely in favor of a working identity that would allow her to function in the American social welfare system without the weight, the curiosity, and the encumbrance of the most famous surname in Central European history. Under that name, she enrolled in a program at Fordham University and wrote her doctoral dissertation on 22 cases of displaced persons served by the Family Service of Catholic Charities in New York. That dissertation is an academic document. It is also one of the most extraordinary personal artifacts in the entire Habsburg story. A woman born in 1921, christened Archduchess Charlotte of Austria, raised in exile by a mother who believed the empire would return, was now sitting in offices in Manhattan conducting interviews with refugees about their displacement, their loss of homeland, their trauma, and their struggle to reconstruct their lives in an unfamiliar country. She was studying, as a professional social worker, the exact condition her own family had been living since 1918. The subjects of her case studies were displaced persons from post-war Europe, people who had lost their countries, their homes, their identities, their legal standing, and who were now attempting to build new selves in a world that did not know what to do with them. Charlotte knew that condition from the inside, whether she chose the topic deliberately, whether there was a moment of conscious recognition in which she understood that her academic subject was also her autobiography, is not something the available sources resolve, and What is clear is that no other member of the family translated the experience of dynastic collapse into practical knowledge as directly and as completely as Charlotte did. She became, in her working life, the professional expert on the condition her family had never been able to name in its own vocabulary: displacement. The war ended, the family survived. But the household Zita had built, first at Leketio, then at Steenekerzeel, then in reduced and improvised form in Quebec, did not survive the peace in any recognizable shape. The children were adults now. They had been scattered across North America by the war, and they did not reassemble into a single unit when it was over. The centrifugal forces of ordinary adult life, marriage, employment, geography, temperament, and this simple human need to build something that belonged to oneself rather than to a dynasty, did what 20 years of exile had not. They broke the household into individual lives. Otto remained in the orbit of European political life, based increasingly in Paris, where the post-war settlement and the emerging institutions of European cooperation gave him a role that his exile identity could inhabit. He was no longer merely a pretender. He was becoming something the post-war world could understand: an internationalist, a Catholic intellectual, a man who could speak to Germans, Hungarians, French, and Americans in their own languages, and who understood the fault lines of Central Europe from the inside. Robert pursued the Austria-Este line with the quiet determination that had characterized him since boyhood. He married Princess Margherita of Savoy-Aosta in 1953, connecting the family to the deposed Italian royal house and ensuring that the dynastic logic, marriages as architecture, alliances as continuation, persisted even without a throne to justify it. Their son, Lorenz, would later marry Princess Astrid of Belgium, giving the Habsburg line a living connection to a reigning European house. Felix married and settled eventually in Mexico, of all places, a location so distant from the courts and capitals of the family's history that it read almost as a rejection of the entire project, except that Felix had never rejected the project. He had rejected the compromise. His refusal to accept the Austrian Republic's terms for re-entry, the renunciation of dynastic claims that the Habsburg law demanded, was not stubbornness for its own sake. It was principle, maintained with a rigidity that made Otto's own eventual compromise look moderate by comparison. Felix would hold that position for the rest of his life. He would die in Mexico City in 2011, the last surviving child of the last emperor, still formally excluded from the country his family had ruled. Karl Ludwig built an American life, business, family, the quiet pragmatism of a man who had accepted that the distance between his childhood and his adulthood was too great to bridge with ideology. Rudolf married, had children, and lived in the post-war European geography of the scattered family. Adelheid, the eldest daughter, remained closest to Zita, the faithful companion of the maternal program. Unmarried, devoted, her life defined by proximity to the mother and the cause. Charlotte continued her social work under her adopted name, translating the family's experience into professional expertise that the world could actually use. Elizabeth, the posthumous child who had never known the father, married Prince Heinrich of Liechtenstein in 1949, folding the Habsburg afterlife into one of the few princely houses in Europe that had retained both sovereignty and territory through every upheaval of the 20th century. Zita herself moved first to New York State, then to Luxembourg, and eventually to Ziesers in the Swiss canton of Graubünden, where she would spend her final decades in a modest house attached to a convent. She did not remarry. She did not abandon the cause. She did not moderate her conviction. She maintained her correspondence with legitimists across Europe, her daily religious observance, and her absolute certainty that the dynasty's rights remained valid even though the dynasty's restoration had become, by any practical assessment, impossible. She was, by the 1950s, a woman in her 60s, whose entire adult life had been shaped by a single objective: the preservation and eventual restoration of the Habsburg crown, and whose children had, one by one, moved into lives that made that objective progressively less relevant to their daily reality. The program had produced extraordinary people. It had not produced a throne. Otto married Regina of Saxe-Meiningen on May 10th, 1951, in Nancy, France. The wedding was conducted with the gravity the family considered appropriate, and the guest list included enough of surviving European royalty, Habsburg loyalists, and Catholic aristocracy to feel like a gathering of the old world's remnants, a reception where the titles outnumbered the countries that recognized them. Regina was not a Habsburg. She came from a German princely family that had lost its own sovereignty in the consolidation of Germany under Bismarck, which meant she understood, as Zita had understood before her, what it meant to live inside a family defined by a rank the world no longer acknowledged. She gave Otto something Zita's program had never quite provided room for, a domestic life that existed for its own sake, not as an annex to a political project. She gave him a household organized around children and meals and daily life rather than around correspondence with legitimist organizations and visitors from vanished courts. She gave him 7 children, including Karl, born on January 11th, 1961, who would eventually succeed his father as head of the house, and Georg, born on December 16th, 1964, who would build a diplomatic career that would eventually lead him to serve as Hungary's ambassador to Spain. The dynasty continued to reproduce itself, but the form of the reproduction had changed. These were not children being raised for a throne. These were children being raised in a household where the memory of the throne was present, but where ordinary post-war European life, school, university, careers, the rhythms of Bavarian provincial society, was increasingly the dominant reality. Otto took up residence in Pucking, on the western shore of the Starnberger Sea in Bavaria, in 1954, and from there he built the public career that would define his remaining decades. He wrote books and articles in multiple languages. He lectured across Europe. He became the most prominent figure in the pan-European movement that Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi had founded in the 1920s and that Otto now inherited as its leading champion. He argued for European integration, not as a technocratic project, but as a civilizational one, an argument that drew directly on the Habsburg experience of governing multiple peoples within a single supranational framework. The parallels were not lost on him or on his audiences. The empire had been, in its way, a prototype for what the European project was attempting: unity without uniformity, shared institutions without shared nationality, a common political framework built on diversity rather than homogeneity. Otto's entire upbringing had been preparation for exactly this kind of argument. The languages, the historical knowledge, the understanding of Central European complexity, the instinct for diplomatic nuance, all of it, every hour of Zita's program, turned out to be transferable to a world that had no use for emperors, but that desperately needed people who could think in European terms. From the outside, that career looked like adaptation. The boy raised for empire had become a European statesman of a new kind, the supranational, institutional, parliamentary. The heir educated in Zita's exile household had found a way to use the languages, the political instinct, the historical consciousness, and the continental perspective that his childhood had given him. He was productive, he was respected. He was, by any fair assessment, an extraordinary man, living an extraordinary life. But the question that had governed his childhood remained unanswered, and by the late 1950s it was approaching the point where it could no longer be deferred. Otto had not renounced the dynastic claim. He had not signed the declaration the Austrian Republic required of any Habsburg who wished to enter the country. He had not formally accepted that the empire was over. He was still in legal terms the pretender, a word the family would not have used but that Austrian constitutional law effectively imposed. He was building a European career on the ruins of a European empire, and he had not yet acknowledged that the ruins were ruins. He was 48 years old. He had been head of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine for 30 years. He had spent his entire adult life as a man without a country of his own, educated for a throne he had never occupied, carrying a title the world had abolished, and building a political identity that depended on the very institutions his family's collapse had helped bring into being. The contradiction had held for 3 decades. It was about to break. And when it broke, it would not be the empire that shattered. The empire had shattered long ago. It would be the fiction on which 8 childhoods had been built, the fiction that the sacrifice had been temporary, that the exile had a destination, and that the program had been worth the price the children paid for it. The life Otto built in Bavaria had the outward shape of successful adaptation. He lived in Pucking with Regina and their growing family. Karl was born in 1961, Georg in 1964, 5 other children filling the house with the noise and mess and routine of ordinary domestic life. He wrote books on European politics and history. He gave lectures in half a dozen languages to audiences across the continent. He served on committees, attended conferences, cultivated the network of Christian democratic politicians, Catholic intellectuals, and pan-European advocates who formed his professional world. He was, by the late 1950s, a figure of genuine standing in European political life, not because of his title, which most of his colleagues treated with polite curiosity or polite indifference, But because of his intelligence, his linguistic range, his seemingly inexhaustible energy, and his understanding of the continent's political architecture at a level of detail that few could match. He was consulted by ministers. He was invited to diplomatic gatherings. He was, in a word that his mother would have recognized and approved, useful. The formation she had given him, the 6 languages, the constitutional history, the Catholic political theology, the instinct for how power worked across borders, had produced a man the post-war world could accommodate. The question was whether the post-war world could accommodate the thing he still carried with him, the unresolved legal and psychological inheritance of a dynasty that the Austrian state had spent 4 decades trying to erase, because Otto had not renounced. That fact, which could be stated in 4 words, was the engine of everything that followed. The Habsburg law of April 1919 had established clear terms. Any member of the house who wished to live as an Austrian citizen, who wished to enter the country, who wished to participate in its civic life, must formally renounce all dynastic claims and declare loyalty to the Republic. The law had been on the books for 40 years. Otto had never complied. He had never signed the declaration. He had never accepted in legal terms that the empire was over and the Republic was legitimate. He continued to be known, in the family and among legitimist circles, as the head of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, a title that had no legal force in Austrian law, but that carried immense symbolic weight in a country whose identity had been shaped, for better and worse, by 6 centuries of Habsburg rule. For most of the interwar and wartime years, that non-compliance had been largely theoretical. Otto was in exile. He was not trying to enter Austria. The law existed as a background condition, a constitutional fact that governed the family's relationship to the Republic without requiring any immediate action. But after 1945, as Austria re-established itself as an independent state, and as Otto's European career grew in prominence, the question became increasingly practical. He was a European political figure who could not set foot in one of Europe's central countries without violating its constitution. He was an advocate for European integration and for the unity of the continent, who was constitutionally barred from the country whose integration into the European project he was publicly and energetically championing. The contradiction was becoming untenable, and everyone involved, and Otto, the Austrian government, the Austrian public, and the broad network of political allies and opponents who had their own reasons for wanting the question settled one way or another, understood it. The issue was not merely legal, it was psychological, and it cut to the very center of this story. The Habsburg law did not simply require Otto to fill out a form. It required him to become, on paper, someone other than the person his mother had spent 40 years creating. It required him to state, in writing, that the claims on which his entire childhood had been built, the claims for which his father had died in a rented house on Madeira, for which the family had been expelled from their homeland, for which 8 children had been educated in borrowed villas, and moated castles and cold rooms in Quebec and at kitchen tables in the Basque country, as were null, void, without legal force. It required him to accept that the program, the languages, the lessons, the governesses, the morning masses, the strict routine, the constant insistence that the children were being formed for a role that history owed them, had been, in the eyes of the law, the cultivation of a fiction. And it required him to do this not in a dramatic scene, not in a throne room or a cathedral or a court of justice surrounded by the symbols of the old order, but on paper, in an office, with a pen and a form and a submission to a government ministry. The banality of the instrument was inseparable from its devastation. Everything the family had endured, compressed into administrative paperwork. Everything Zita had kept alive, extinguished by a bureaucratic procedure. The Austrian political landscape of the late 1950s made the question urgent but also toxic. The 2 major parties, the conservative Austrian People's Party and the Social Democrats, were locked in a coalition that governed by consensus, and the Habsburg question was one of the few issues capable of fracturing that consensus entirely. The People's Party contained Catholic and conservative elements sympathetic to the Habsburgs, or at least unwilling to maintain a law they considered punitive and anachronistic. The Social Democrats regarded any softening of the Habsburg law as an affront to the Republic's founding principles, the principles of 1918 of democratic self-determination, of the rejection of dynastic rule. For the Social Democrats, the law was not a relic. It was a load-bearing wall. Remove it, and you undermine the ideological foundation on which the Republic stood. Into this charged atmosphere, Otto moved toward compliance. The precise sequence of events is documented in Austrian constitutional history and in the records of the Verfassungsgerichtshof, the Constitutional Court, and the deliberate bureaucratic pace of the proceedings is itself part of the story's emotional texture. In the spring of 1961, Otto drafted a declaration in which he renounced his membership of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine and declared his loyalty to the Austrian Republic. The language was careful, lawyerly, and designed to satisfy the formal requirements of the Habsburg law while preserving as much of his dignity and his family's historical identity as the legal framework permitted. There would be no ceremony. There would be no witnesses from the old court. There would be no moment of public theater in which the last crown prince surrendered his inheritance before the nation. There would be a document, a signature, and a submission to the Ministry of the Interior. The administrative plainness of the instrument was part of what made it so devastating. A claim that had been maintained through death, exile, war, poverty, the loss of every palace and every title, and every legal privilege the dynasty had ever possessed, a claim that Zita had kept alive through sheer force of will for nearly 4 decades, would end not with a grand renunciation, but with paperwork. Otto signed. The date was in May 1961. He was 48 years old. And with that signature, the boy who had stood beside his father at the Hungarian coronation in 1916, the child who had been brought to his father's deathbed on Madeira in 1922, the young man whose education had been organized from his 9th year around the assumption that he would one day reclaim what his family had lost, formally surrendered the legal basis of that assumption. The declaration transformed him, on paper, from Otto of Austria into Dr. Otto Habsburg Lothringen. The dynastic title was gone. The membership of the house was gone. The legal continuity between the child photographed at the coronation and the man signing the document in a government office was, in constitutional terms, severed. He was now, in the eyes of the Austrian state, a private citizen with an unusual surname, an impressive curriculum vitae, and no dynastic standing whatsoever. Everything Zita had built, the lessons, the languages, the ceremonies, the faith, the etiquette, the daily insistence that the children were Habsburgs and that being Habsburg meant something the Republic could not erase, was in a single administrative act rendered legally void, and then the act was rejected. The Austrian government received the declaration and the political system detonated. The Social Democrats argued that Otto's declaration was insufficient, that it was too carefully worded, too hedged, that it did not represent a genuine renunciation, but rather a tactical maneuver designed to gain entry while preserving the substance of the dynastic claim behind a screen of legal language. The People's Party argued that the declaration met the law's requirements and that refusing it was an act of political spite. The cabinet fractured, parliament debated, the press divided along predictable lines, and what should have been a private legal matter, a man signing a form to enter his own country, became a constitutional crisis that consumed Austrian politics for the next 5 years. The bureaucratic and legal stages that followed are worth tracking, not because their procedural details are inherently dramatic, but because their sheer duration reveals what was really happening. This was not a government processing a routine application. This was a state wrestling, openly and acrimoniously, with the question of whether its most famous exile could be permitted to come home, and what his homecoming would mean for the story the Republic told about itself. Otto's declaration was submitted to the Ministry of the Interior in 1961. The ministry examined it. Political controversy erupted immediately. The Social Democrats challenged the declaration's adequacy. The People's Party defended it. The coalition government, which depended on cooperation between the two parties, was suddenly unable to cooperate on the most symbolically charged question in Austrian public life. The issue was referred to the administrative court, arguments were heard, briefs were filed, the language of the declaration was parsed, debated, and analyzed with an intensity that would have been appropriate for a treaty, and that was in context being applied to a single man's request to enter his own country. The administrative court ruled in 1963 that the declaration satisfied the legal requirements of the Habsburg law. Otto had complied. The law's conditions had been met. The ruling should have settled the matter. It did not. The Social Democrats refused to accept the court's judgment as the final word. They argued that the political question, whether a Habsburg should be permitted to return, was separate from the legal question, and that the political answer was no. The coalition fractured further. Parliamentary debates grew heated. The press published editorials, op-eds, denunciations, and defenses. The affair acquired a name, the Habsburg crisis. and the name itself became a fixture of Austrian political vocabulary, a shorthand for the country's unresolved relationship with its own past. Otto waited. He was in Peking, in Bavaria, writing, lecturing, raising his children, building his European career, and waiting, as his family had been waiting, in one form or another, since March 1919, for permission to enter a country that his ancestors had governed since the 13th century. 5 years. From the signing of the declaration in 1961 to the first actual entry in 1966, 5 years passed. 5 years of legal proceedings, parliamentary debates, cabinet crises, editorial warfare, and the slow grinding of a political machine that could neither accept Otto nor find a principled reason to keep rejecting him. For a man who had already waited 42 years, 5 more might have seemed trivial. They were not. They were the years in which the meaning of the renunciation sank in, not as a legal event, but as an emotional one. Otto had surrendered the claim, and the country was still arguing about whether to let him through the door. While Otto waited, the family responded in ways that tracked the fault lines the program had created between them. Zita, at Zeisers in her modest Swiss house attached to the Johanneum, maintained her position with the ferocity of total conviction. She was approaching 70. She had been a widow for 4 decades. She had spent those decades raising children, managing a household in exile, maintaining a network of legitimate sympathizers, and refusing with absolute consistency to accept that the Habsburg law had any moral authority over her family. Otto's declaration, however carefully worded, however tactically necessary, however much it might be understood as a pragmatic step toward a larger goal, represented in Zita's theological framework a concession to an illegitimate order. The Republic had no right to demand what it was demanding. The dynasty's claims existed by a right that preceded the Republic and that the Republic could not extinguish. Whether Zita opposed the declaration openly to Otto, or whether she accepted it with visible reluctance while maintaining her private principles, depends on the source and the period. What is certain is that she never wavered in her own conviction. She never signed a comparable declaration herself. She would go to her grave in 1989 at 96, believing the dynasty's rights were intact, regardless of what her eldest son had put his name to. Felix's response was the sharpest and the most narratively revealing. He refused. Where Otto calculated and negotiated and maneuvered toward a compromise that would give him access to Austria at the cost of the legal claim, Felix simply declined to participate in the process. He would not renounce. He would not declare loyalty to the Republic. He would not accept that the Habsburg law had any authority over him. That refusal was not casual or unconsidered. It was the expression of a temperament that had been forming since childhood, the stubbornness that the Laquetio governesses would have recognized, hardened by decades into principle. Felix's refusal kept him legally outside Austria in a stricter and more permanent sense than Otto, and it made him, for the purposes of this story, the sibling who kept the original wound visible. He was the living proof that the family's response to the Habsburg law was not unanimous, that the program Zita had built could produce not only pragmatic adaptation, but also intransigent fidelity to the original premise. In narrative terms, Felix is the brother who makes Otto's compromise legible by refusing to share it. Without Felix's refusal, Otto's renunciation might look like simple pragmatism. With it, it looks like what it was, a choice between two forms of loss. The other siblings had, by this point, built lives where the question of Austrian re-entry mattered in different ways and to different degrees. Adelheid, still beside Zita in Switzerland, still unmarried, still living inside the gravitational field of the maternal household, was directly affected by the law's ongoing force. She had been born before April 10th, 1919, which meant the law applied to her personally. She could not enter Austria without making a declaration of her own. That restriction had shaped her entire adult life, not as a dramatic prohibition, but as a constant, quiet limitation that determined where she could travel, whom she could visit, and what relationship she could maintain with the country that had been her birthplace. Robert, with his Austria Este line, his wife Margarita, and his family in Europe, navigated the legal landscape with this steady pragmatism that had always characterized him. Karl Ludwig in America had already crossed a distance of identity so great that the Austrian border was almost beside the point. He had remade himself as an American, and the Habsburg law governed a country he had left as an infant. Charlotte, working under the name de Bar in New York, had made her accommodation with the world as it was, rather than the world as Zita insisted it should be. Rudolf had his own family. his own trajectory, his own way of carrying the name. Elizabeth, married into the House of Liechtenstein, had a stable position inside a princely household that provided the status and the structure the Habsburg collapse had destroyed. Each sibling's relationship to the renunciation crisis was shaped by where they had ended up and how much of the original program they still carried. The same household had produced 8 different answers to the same question. The crisis resolved itself not with a declaration of principle, but with the exhaustion of the parties involved. The administrative court had ruled. The legal path was clear. The political resistance, though fierce, could not sustain itself indefinitely against a court ruling, and the growing sense among the Austrian public that the whole affair was becoming an embarrassment. Otto was finally permitted to enter Austria. He did so on October 31st, 1966, 47 years after he had left as a 6-year-old child on a train escorted by a British colonel. He went to Innsbruck. He did not go to Vienna. He did not go to the Hofburg. He did not visit Schönbrunn. The choice of Innsbruck, a Tyrolean city at the western edge of the country, far from the capital, far from the palaces, far from the political center, was itself a concession, a calculation designed to minimize the symbolic charge of the event by placing it as far as possible from the locations that would have made the return feel like a restoration. It did not work. Otto's brief visit triggered a political eruption that exceeded anything the concession had been designed to prevent. The Social Democrats called for a general strike. The Austrian Trade Union Federation backed the call. On the day of Otto's arrival, workers across the country walked off their jobs. Factories stopped. Public transport was disrupted. Demonstrations filled the streets of Innsbruck and other cities. The man who had spent 47 years waiting to come home arrived to find that his homecoming was, for a significant portion of the Austrian population, not a reunion, but a provocation. The images from those days, if the documentary can locate the archival footage, would be among the most powerful in the entire script. A middle-aged man in a suit walking through an Austrian city under police escort, surrounded not by cheering crowds or ceremonial guard, but by protest signs, picket lines, and the visible anger of workers who regarded his presence as an insult to the republic their grandparents had built. The homecoming that Zita had organized the entire exile household around. The return that had justified the program, the languages, the governor's diaries, the morning masses, the strict Catholic routine, the years in Lakitio and Steenokkerzeil in Quebec, looked nothing like what anyone in the family had imagined during those decades of preparation. It looked like a man visiting a country that did not know what to do with him. There is something about that scene worth sitting with. Otto was 54 years old. He had been in exile for 47 of those years. He had spent his entire conscious life being prepared for this country, taught its history in borrowed schoolrooms, taught its languages by hired tutors, taught the constitutional structures of a state that had been dissolved before he was old enough to read. He had absorbed since the age of 9 his mother's fierce and unwavering certainty that the exile was temporary, that the return would vindicate everything the family had endured, and that the children's suffering had purpose because the destination was real. And now he was here. He was in Austria. He was standing on Austrian soil for the first time since he had left it as a child on a train with British military escort in 1919. And the country did not want him, or rather, the country was so deeply divided about what his name meant, about what his presence signified, about what admitting a Habsburg back onto Austrian soil said about the Republic's relationship with its own past, that his arrival functioned not as a homecoming, but as a detonation. The workers who struck were not striking against Otto as a man. They were striking against what his name represented, the old dynastic order, the pre-democratic principle, the world of Habsburg privilege and Catholic hierarchy that the Republic of 1918 had been founded to replace. They were striking against the possibility that the past might walk back in. And Otto, standing in Innsbruck in the late autumn of 1966, a middle-aged man in a suit surrounded by police and protesters, was the living embodiment of that possibility. Not because he posed any genuine threat to the Republic, but because the Republic's sense of itself still depended on his absence. He left. He returned to Bavaria. The visit lasted a matter of days, and the central tragedy of this story, which is not a death, not a scandal, not a single catastrophic event, but the slow, grinding, bureaucratic destruction of a family's founding myth, was complete. The child raised for empire had surrendered the legal language of the claim in order to enter a country that received him with strikes and hostility. The program that Zita had maintained for 4 decades, through widowhood, exile, 2 wars, poverty, displacement, and the dispersal of her children across 3 continents, had produced not a restoration, but a constitutional crisis, a court ruling, 5 years of political paralysis, a hostile homecoming in a provincial city, and the quiet, undeniable recognition that the Habsburg future in Austria would exist only as memory, cultural symbolism, and the residue of a name that could no longer command what it once commanded. The family survived. The dynasty, as a living political project, did not. The dynastic childhood, the world Zita had built from the wreckage of the empire, the program she had maintained with such extraordinary force of will, did not survive the signature, the court ruling, and the picket lines. It survived only as the thing it had always, underneath the theology and the etiquette, most truly been: a mother's attempt to give her children's suffering a meaning. What remained, after the crisis subsided and the protests faded and Otto returned to his life in Bavaria, was quieter and in some ways more devastating than the crisis itself. There was no single moment of reckoning. There was no confrontation between Otto and Zita in which the meaning of what had happened was laid bare. There was no family meeting at which the children gathered to acknowledge that the project was over. Instead, there was a slow, undramatic settling, like a house shifting on its foundations after a tremor, the walls still standing, but the alignment permanently changed. The question had been answered, and the answer was that the dynasty would continue to exist as a family, but not as a political project. The name would survive, the claim would not. Otto continued his European career with the energy and the focus of a man who had found, in the wreckage of one vocation, the materials for another. He visited Austria again in subsequent years, and the visits grew quieter, less charged, less politically dangerous, as the country gradually accustomed itself to the idea that a Habsburg could walk its streets without the Republic falling. He was elected to the European Parliament in 1979, representing a Bavarian constituency for the Christian Social Union, which made him, in constitutional terms, a German parliamentarian, serving in a European institution, a man without Austrian citizenship occupying a seat that gave him influence over the very policies that would shape Austria's future relationship with Europe. He served until 1999. He was effective. He was tireless. He used the languages and the historical knowledge and the instinct for continental politics that Zita's program had given him, and he used them well. He became one of the most visible advocates for European integration, for the opening of the Iron Curtain, for the rights of Central European peoples to rejoin the European project from which the Cold War had excluded them. He helped organize the Pan-European picnic on the Austro-Hungarian border near Sopron in August 1989, an event at which hundreds of East Germans crossed into Austria, one of the symbolic preludes to the fall of the Berlin Wall 3 months later. The irony was almost too layered to bear. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the man who had been expelled from Austria as a child and who had spent his adult life arguing for the unity of the continent his family had once ruled, was now helping to dismantle the very barrier that divided that continent. He would, in other words, spend the second half of his life converting the inheritance his mother had given him into something the modern world could use. Not a throne, but a voice. Not sovereignty, but influence. Not an empire, but an argument for what an empire, at its most generous, had aspired to be. But the cost had been paid, and it had been paid not only by Otto, but by everyone the program had touched. The boy who was dressed in Hungarian costume at the coronation in 1916 had become a man who signed away his dynastic identity in an office in 1961, and then waited 5 years for permission to enter a country that greeted him with a strike. The widow, who had converted her husband's death into a program for her children's formation, had watched from her quiet house in Switzerland as her eldest son surrendered the legal basis of that program in order to set foot on soil that the family had once governed from the Hofburg. The siblings who had absorbed the dynasty's meaning at different depths and different temperatures had scattered into lives that ranged from Felix's absolute refusal in Mexico City, to Charlotte's compassionate anonymity in New York, to Elizabeth's princely marriage and values, to Carl Ludwig's pragmatic American reinvention, to Adelheide's faithful vigil beside the mother who would not let go. There was no neat resolution. There was no moment when the family gathered and agreed on what the program had meant, on whether the sacrifice had been justified, on whether the children raised for restoration had been served well or damaged by the education they received. There was only the slow recognition, settling through the family like winter settling through a house, that the sacrifice had been real, that the program had shaped them all in ways that could not be undone, and that what it had shaped them for no longer existed in any form the world was prepared to recognize. The boy prepared for empire had become a European statesman. The widow's regime had become a memory held in a Swiss convent. The children had become old or were becoming old, and this century that had destroyed their world was moving toward its close. And the question that now remained, and the question the final act of this story must sit with, was what, if anything, survived, not of the title or the claim or the legal fiction that had been formally surrendered in a ministry office in 1961, but of the family itself, of the people inside the name, of what Zita's program had actually produced. Once you stripped away the politics and the theology and the borrowed villas and the governess diaries and looked at what was left, 8 lives shaped by a vanished world, lived out in a century that had no place for what they were raised to be, and that they had, each in their own distinct and unrepeatable way, managed to find a place in all the same. The imperial children did not die together. They died across 4 decades, one by one, in different countries, under different circumstances, at different distances from the world that had produced them. The rhythm of their disappearance is the rhythm of the 20th century's long aftermath. Not a single catastrophe, but an ordinary, relentless attrition, each death removing another witness to the household Zita had built and the childhood it had imposed. Adelheid was the first. She died on October the 2nd, 1971, in Pocking, Bavaria, at the age of 57. She had never married. She had never built a public career. She had spent her adult life inside the gravitational field of the family and close to Zita, close to the household's rhythms, attending to the mother and the cause with a devotion that was neither dramatic nor reluctant, but simply continuous. A daughter who had absorbed the program so completely that she could not imagine a life outside it. She was the eldest daughter of the last emperor, born at Hetzendorf in January 1914, old enough to have carried fragments of the imperial years in her memory, young enough that those fragments were more like weather than architecture, an atmosphere she remembered without being able to reconstruct. Her death is not in itself the material of high drama. She was not famous. She did not transform the family's inheritance into a political career like Otto, or invert it into social work like Charlotte, or refuse its terms like Felix. She simply lived inside the orbit her mother had created, and she died inside it, and the orbit continued without her. What makes Adelheid's death essential to this story is not the death itself, but what happened around it. A detail so small it could be missed in a longer account, and so devastating that it should be held for the very end. That detail will come. It belongs at the closing. Charlotte died on July 23rd, 1989, in Munich at the age of 68. She was the sibling who had made the most complete translation of the dynastic inheritance into a form the modern world could use and understand. Charlotte de Bar, the name she had chosen for herself, the name she had worked under, the name on her Fordham dissertation, and her professional identity, spent her working life among displaced persons, refugees in the urban poor of New York. She studied their conditions with academic rigor. She served them with practical care. She understood their experience from the inside, even if she never said so in the language of her case files or her dissertation footnotes. She had lived for 25 years before she began her professional training, the exact condition she would spend the rest of her career addressing: the loss of homeland, the loss of status, the need to rebuild an identity in a country that did not know or care who you had been before you arrived. Whether she found peace in that symmetry, whether the act of serving others who had been displaced healed something in her that the Habsburg displacement had broken, whether she ever acknowledged to a colleague or a friend or a priest what her birth name actually was and what world it came from, these are things the available sources do not resolve. What is clear is that she lived a life of quiet, sustained, professional service, that the service was inseparable from the family experience that had produced her, and that she died without having sought or received public recognition for the extraordinary arc her biography had traced. From archduchess to exile to student to Charlotte de Bar, from the vanished world of Schönbrunn to the intake offices of Catholic charities on the streets of Manhattan. She is the sibling who most clearly demonstrates what happens when a dynastic education meets an egalitarian vocation. The program gave her the languages, the discipline, and the capacity for sustained work. The world gave her the subject. She put them together without any of the grandeur her mother would have preferred. Zita outlived Charlotte by only 4 months. She died on March 14, 1989, in Zeisers, Switzerland, at the age of 96. She had outlived her husband by 67 years. She had outlived the empire by 71. She had outlived 3 of her own children. She had maintained her conviction to the absolute end. The conviction that the dynasty's rights were valid, that the exile had been unjust, that the program she had built for her children had been the right response to an intolerable situation, and that history, or God, or both, would eventually vindicate what the world had refused to restore. In her final years, she was frail, nearly blind, and increasingly confined to the modest quarters she occupied at the Johanneum in Zeisers. She still attended Mass daily. She still received visitors when they came, with the composure and the upright bearing of a woman who had been trained from her own childhood in a dispossessed Bourbon Parma household, never to permit circumstances to dictate how she carried herself. She had been an empress for 2 years. She had been a widow for 67. She had been in exile for 70. The proportions of her life tell their own story. Her funeral, held in Vienna on April 1st, 1989, 67 years to the day after Charles's death on Madeira, was the closest thing to a Habsburg state occasion the Austrian Republic had permitted since the monarchy's end. The government authorized it after deliberation. The decision was not without controversy, but the political temperature around the Habsburg question had cooled considerably since the crisis of the 1960s, and there was a growing sense, even among those who had no sympathy for the dynasty, that Zita had earned, by sheer longevity and by the dignity of her suffering, the right to be buried with the family she had spent her life defending. Tens of thousands of people lined the streets of Vienna. The procession wound through the inner Stadt toward the Kapuzinerkirche. The coffin was draped in black. Foreign dignitaries and representatives of European royal and princely houses attended. And at the door of the Kapuziner Gruft, the imperial crypt where Habsburgs had been interred for nearly 4 centuries, the ancient ritual was performed. A knock at the door, a voice from within asking who sought entry. The titles recited in full: Zita, Empress of Austria, Queen of Hungary, Queen of Bohemia. The republic that had abolished those titles permitted them one last time to echo off the stone. Then the door opened, and the woman who had been barred from entering Austria for most of her adult life was carried inside to be placed among the dead of the dynasty she had served since October 1911. ORF, the Austrian state broadcaster, covered the funeral extensively, and the footage, if obtainable for the documentary, and would carry immense visual and emotional weight. It shows Vienna performing, with evident ambivalence and evident seriousness, the ceremonial language of a world it had spent 7 decades claiming to have left behind. Elizabeth died on January 6, 1993, in Wolstein, Austria, at the age of 70. She had lived as Princess Heinrich of Liechtenstein, the wife of a reigning prince's son, inside a household that provided the structure and the status the Habsburg collapse had destroyed. She was the posthumous child, the daughter who had never seen the father, and her death closed a particular kind of circle. The girl born into absence died in a country that her family had once ruled and that had spent decades arguing about whether her eldest brother could be permitted to visit. Robert died on February 7, 1996, in Basel, Switzerland, at the age of 80. He had carried the Austria-Este line with quiet steadiness, married into the Savoy-Aosta family, and produced descendants who connected the Habsburgs to the Belgian royal house through his son Lorenz's marriage to Princess Astrid. Robert's legacy was genealogical rather than political, the dynasty continuing to reproduce itself through marriage even after the political purpose of dynastic marriage had vanished. He had done what the family had always done. He had secured the next generation. The difference was that the next generation would inherit a network rather than an empire. Carl Ludwig died on December 11, 2007, in Brussels at the age of 89. He had lived the most thoroughly adapted life of all the siblings: American military service, a business career, an adult existence built on the pragmatic foundations of a world that did not need archdukes. Of all the children, Carl Ludwig had crossed the greatest distance between his childhood and his adult identity, and he had done it without public drama, without a dissertation on displacement, without refusing to sign anything. He had simply moved forward. Whether that constituted acceptance or merely survival is again a question the story leaves open. Rudolf died on May 15, 2010, in Brussels at the age of 90. He was the first child born in exile, the hinge between memory and story, and his death left only 2 of the imperial children still alive, Otto and Felix. Otto died on July 4th, 2011, in Pocking, Bavaria, at the age of 98. He had spent 89 of those years, and since the age of 9, since the morning his father died in a rented house on Madeira, as the central figure of the Habsburg family's post-imperial existence, he had been the vessel, the instrument, the child for whom the entire exile household was constructed. He had carried the burden longer than anyone could reasonably have been expected to carry it, and he had converted it, through sheer intellectual energy and political skill, into something the modern world could recognize as contribution rather than pretension. His funeral, like Zita's, was held in Vienna, at St. Stephen's Cathedral, the Gothic cathedral at the heart of the city that had been the Habsburgs' capital for 6 centuries. The procession carried the coffin through the streets to the Kapuzinergruft. The ritual knock was performed again. The titles were recited again. Otto, former Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary, Royal Prince of Hungary and Bohemia. The Republic buried the last Crown Prince with the full Habsburg funeral tradition, and the streets were lined with mourners, tourists, and the simply curious, people who had come to see the final act of a dynasty whose political life had ended before most of them were born. Otto was interred in the imperial crypt. His heart, following a Habsburg custom that separated the body's organs for burial in multiple locations, was taken to the Benedictine Abbey of Pannonhalma in Hungary, the country where he had stood as a 4-year-old child in white Hungarian costume beside his father at the coronation in 1916. 95 years later, the heart returned. The rest of him remained in Vienna. Even in death, the old empire's geography asserted itself, dividing the man between the two halves of the dual monarchy he had been born to unite. Felix died on September 6, 2011, in Mexico City, 2 months after Otto, at the age of 95. He was the last surviving child of Charles and Zita. He had lived in Mexico for decades, had married, had raised a family there, and had built a life at the furthest possible geographical remove from the courts and corridors his parents had inhabited. Mexico City to the Hofburg is not merely a journey across an ocean. It is a journey across civilizations, across centuries, across every assumption about how a life, shaped by European dynastic politics, should be lived. And yet Felix had never surrendered the principle that connected him to the Hofburg. He had never renounced. He had never signed the declaration. He had never accepted the Austrian Republic's authority to dictate the terms of his identity. He remained, to the end, the sibling who kept the uncompromised version of Zita's position alive. Not as a political program, since Felix had no political program and no prospect of one, but as a matter of personal conviction, maintained for its own sake, maintained because his mother had taught him that some things cannot be traded away, and because he believed her. His death closed the generation. 8 children, born between 1912 and 1922, raised in exile by a mother who refused to let the empire die inside her household, educated for a world that never returned, scattered across Europe and the Americas by war and adaptation and the ordinary drift of lives lived under extraordinary pressure. All of them gone. The imperial nursery was empty. The borrowed villas were empty. The moated castle was someone else's property. The governor's diaries were in an archive. And the century that had destroyed the world those children were born into was itself almost over. The cultural afterlife of this family lives more in biography, archive, and institutional memory than in dramatization. Gordon Brooks Shepard's Uncrowned Emperor. The Life and Times of Otto von Habsburg is the most substantial English-language biography and maps the exile to Europe arc that this documentary follows. Its chapter structure alone traces the journey from Habsburg Crown Prince to European parliamentarian. The long-running German-language documentary series Das, Blieb vom Doppeladler, included filmed interviews with Otto and Zita and provides invaluable visual material from the later decades of the exile. ORF's archival coverage of Zita's 1989 funeral and Otto's 2011 funeral preserves the ceremonial returns in broadcast form, and both events were covered extensively by the European press, creating a body of contemporary documentation that any future dramatist would draw on. But there is no widely cited prestige scripted drama centered specifically on the children's exiled childhood. No equivalent of The Crown, no definitive limited series, no novelization that took the private texture of Lecatio or Steno Kerzel or Quebec and rendered it as popular narrative. The afterlife exists instead in a different and perhaps more durable form: institutional, archival, and family maintained. The Otto von Habsburg Foundation, established in Budapest, now preserves and digitizes a vast documentary legacy. Thousands of indexed volumes of correspondence, tens of thousands of pages of political reports, personal letters, memoranda, photographs, and film footage, turning what was once the private paperwork of a dynastic household into researchable, publicly accessible history. The foundation is serious, well-organized, and growing. It represents the final transformation of the Habsburg project. The dynasty that once governed a state now governs an archive. The family that once organized an empire now curates its memory. And the memory, preserved in those indexed files and digitized documents, is more detailed, more intimate, and more human than the public legend ever was. What remains, as of this recording, is not empire, but network, and not sovereignty, but the particular kind of service that a family with 6 centuries of European history behind it is uniquely positioned to provide. Karl Habsburg Lothringen, born on January 11, 1961, is 65 years old and serves as head of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine. He lives in Salzburg. He has built his public life around the causes that Otto's later career pioneered: European politics, the protection of cultural heritage in conflict zones, through his leadership of Blue Shield International, and the preservation and promotion of the family's historical legacy through public engagement and institutional work. He carries the name. He does not carry a claim. He speaks publicly about the family's history with a frankness that neither Zita's theology nor Otto's careful diplomacy would have permitted. And his approach to the dynasty's meaning is, in its own way, the most radical transformation any of them have achieved. He treats it as heritage rather than politics, as something to be shared and contextualized rather than defended and restored. Georg Habsburg Lothringen, born on December 16, 1964, is 61 and currently serves as Hungary's ambassador to France. He previously served as ambassador to Spain. His diplomatic career, representing Hungary, the other half of the old dual monarchy, in the courts and capitals of Western Europe, would have been unimaginable to Charles and Zita, but makes perfect sense as the latest expression of the family's supranational instinct. The Habsburgs always moved between countries and cultures. They still do. The difference is that they now move between them as citizens, diplomats, and advocates rather than as sovereigns. The multilingual formation that Zita insisted upon, the historical consciousness that the program drilled into every child, the instinct for European diplomacy that was supposed to equip them for restoration. All of it turned out to be exactly the training needed for the careers Karl and Georg have built. Zita's program failed in its stated objective. It succeeded perhaps in ways she did not intend and would not have chosen. The palaces are museums now. Schönbrunn receives millions of visitors a year. The Hofburg houses, government offices, the National Library, and a collection of imperial silverware displayed behind glass. The royal palace in Budapest overlooks the Danube as it always did, but the rooms are galleries and exhibition spaces, and the sovereignty that once operated inside them is a chapter in a guidebook. The family continues. Karl has children. Georg has children. Robert's descendants are woven into the Belgian royal family through Lorenz's marriage to Princess Astrid. But it continues as a European family of distinction, deeply conscious of its history, active in public service, and no longer defined by a political claim. The program is over. What it produced endures in the people it shaped, in the institutions they built, in the archive that holds the evidence of what it cost, and in the question it leaves behind, whether the sacrifice was worth it, and whether any parent can answer that question for the children who paid the price. What this family's story reveals is not simply that empires end. Everybody knows that empires end. What is harder to sit with is what happens when a family refuses, for reasons of faith and duty and memory and love, to let the inner structure end with it. Zita had the name. She had the history. She had the conviction and the will and the languages and the iron self-discipline. She did not have a country to hand to her children, so she handed them something stranger, a program, a set of values, a daily discipline, and the insistence that loss was temporary. Some of them turned that inheritance into service. Some turned it into stubbornness. Some quietly slipped into other lives under other names. There is no neat moral in that. There is only the image of a mother who outlived an empire, a husband, and several of her children, and who still could not cross the border in time for one daughter's funeral. Adelheid died in 1971 in Bavaria. Zita could not attend. The old restrictions that the Habsburg law imposed on those born before April 1919 still applied. The empire was gone. The daughter was dead. And the mother was still on the wrong side of a law created to arrest the political world that had given her family its name, its meaning, and its reason for existing.